When you are exploring with barrels of flour and losses and gains of yardage in football on the last activity, we came to, hopefully you came to an understanding of numbers and their opposites. It's pretty intuitive to know that 5 and -5 are opposites. And whenever you add a number to its opposite, you always get 0. So, the opposite of -10 is +10. The opposite of 4 is -4. Those are all opposites. In fact, whenever we see a negative sign, it's just as accurate to say, instead of -4, you can say the opposite of 4. And that comes in handy in situations like this. If I want to read the opposite of -10, well, it makes sense that the opposite of -10 is +10. So it has a negative sign in front, but it's not actually a negative number because it's the opposite of a negative number. Often when we are reading mathematical expressions, if we see this sign, it's actually more helpful to say the words the opposite of. In part for situations like this, but especially when we're talking about variables. I say -x, it sounds like that's definitely a negative number, but it depends on what x is. If I say the opposite of x for x equals 3, well, just like always when evaluating expressions, we show replacement. We have the opposite of, that part comes down, and x itself is 3. So the opposite of x when x is 3 is a negative number. However, the opposite of x for x equals -2, when I show replacement, I have to show the opposite sign, and x is -2. So the opposite of -2 is +2. The point here is that when you see a negative sign in front of a variable, it is not always a negative number. If you show replacement and then read the opposite of, read as the opposite of, it will be quite clear what you have going. Parts of learning about integers is the idea of absolute value. Technically, absolute value is the distance that a number has from 0. And that's on the number line. Or thinking about it, I guess number line is just one way to think about it. But for example, if this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If this is 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is -4, they are both 4 places away from 0. So the symbol for absolute value are these straight lines. The way you would read this is the absolute value of 4 is 4, because as we've seen, 4 has 1, 2, 3, 4 spots from 0. However, the absolute value of -4 is also 4, because it too is 4 spaces away from 0. So, as distance can't be a negative number, it doesn't make sense to have negative feet or negative miles. The thing to remember is that absolute value is always positive. Now, all of these, the idea of opposites can combine in statements. For example, if I want to know what the absolute value of -11 plus 7 is the absolute value symbols work as grouping symbols. So, just like with grouping symbols, I have to do what's inside first. We're going to do this in the next lesson. The absolute value of negative 11 is positive 11. Maybe I am doing this out of order. Maybe they don't have that. Keep this in mind for the future, though. If I say the opposite of the absolute value of negative 5, remember, I could call this negative absolute value negative 5, but this is, again, another place where it makes much more sense to call it the opposite of the absolute value of negative 5. These are grouping symbols. So what is the absolute value of negative 5? It's positive 5. And then the opposite of that is negative. So although absolute value itself can never be positive, the opposite of absolute value can be negative. Absolute value can only be positive, but the opposite of it can be negative. The opposite of the absolute value of positive 5 is also negative 5, because the absolute value of 5 is positive 5, and this is negative. So these are things that you really need to get in the habit of thinking, and as much as possible, when the negative sign is outside grouping symbols or outside of a variable, it will help you to think of it as to say it to yourself as the opposite of, because that's really what negatives are.